At the age of 49, Patrick Vieira is remembered as one of the greatest midfielders in modern soccer history, a symbol of strength, character, and rare leadership on the pitch, a player who rose to the top with the French national team when they won the World Cup 1998 and continued to affirm his status with the Euro 2000 title, becoming an irreplaceable pillar in the golden generation alongside Zinedine Zidane. At the club level, he was the soul of Arsenal under Arsene Wenger, where he won 3 Premier League titles, 4 FA Cups, and especially the unbeaten 2003-2004 season, a feat that not many teams in history could touch. With the captain's armband on his arm, Vieira not only controlled the midfield but also shaped the fighting identity of the entire team. His duels with Roy Keane became symbols of a brutal era. After that, he continued to add to his trophy collection at Inter Milan, with multiple Serie A titles, before closing out his playing career in the colors of Manchester City, a journey spanning nearly 2 decades with countless titles, recognition, and the status of a true legend, a man who conquered almost every peak soccer could offer, a name remembered not just by numbers, but by his profound influence on how people understand the role of a central midfielder. But behind all that glory was a man who had never truly been able to rest, a child who grew up in the void of his father's absence, carrying a feeling of abandonment that no title could erase. That very deprivation forced him to become strong from a very early age, learning to stay silent in the face of pain, learning to stand firm when there was no one behind him, and when he stepped into top-level soccer that did not disappear but only changed shape, becoming the pressure to always be perfect, to always be the leader, to always hide his own fatigue. Even in his most brilliant years at Arsenal, when the whole world praised him as a leader, he still had to fight with deep-seated doubts, with the fear of failure that had never left him. And when he left, when time began to take back what it had given, he had to face another kind of pain, the feeling of no longer being the center, no longer being himself. But instead of collapsing, he kept moving forward, not because everything became easier, but because he had never allowed himself to stop. And perhaps that was the hardest part of his life, not the victories, but having to continue enduring in silence, even when no one was watching anymore. Before we continue into the deeper chapters of Patrick Vieira's life, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to honor a man who carried a weight not everyone could see. At the age of 49, when Patrick Vieira stands quietly after everything he has achieved, it is hard to imagine that the journey began from such a distant and fragile place, from his early days in Senegal, where his childhood should have been filled with warmth, laughter, and the simple sense of security of a child. But reality did not unfold that way, because from a very early age, life had begun to take away the most basic things a person needs. His family left their homeland for France when he was still young, a change that was not only geographical, but also emotional, because for a child, leaving a familiar place meant losing the little he could call his own. And in that very transition period, the most painful thing happened. His father left the family, without explanation, without any warning sign, without a promise to return, only a quiet disappearance powerful enough to collapse the small world of a child who had not yet understood. And it was that very silence that made the pain so persistent, because there were no words, no clear ending, only a void stretching through each day, each year, growing in a way no one could see. And in the heart of that boy, the question, why, existed without ever having an answer. In France, life did not open with an easy start. The suburbs where his family lived were not a place for dreams, but a place where each person had to learn to survive before thinking about living. And in that situation, Vieira's mother became the only pillar, a woman carrying not only economic responsibility, but also the mental stability of the family. But no matter how strong she was, she could not completely fill the void his father had left. And so Vieira grew up between two things existing in parallel. On one side, his mother's quiet sacrifice. On the other, the unnameable absence of his father. And between those two things, he learned to stay silent. Not because he felt nothing, but because he gradually realized that no one really asked how he felt. No one had enough time to listen to things that could not be seen with the eyes. And so emotions were pushed inside, accumulating little by little, becoming a part of who he was that even he could not separate. Those years had no long conversations, no clear words of encouragement, no one telling him everything would be okay. Only days passing in silence, where a child had to learn on his own how to understand the world without a guide, had to stand up on his own without anyone behind him. And gradually, that became a habit, a survival mechanism. He did not seek help, did not expect recognition, did not allow himself to become weak, because in his mind, weakness had no place in the life he was living. And from that, a shell began to form, not to hide from others, but to protect himself from feeling too much, because sometimes feeling was the most painful thing. There were children who grew up with memories of hugs, of praise, of unconditional acceptance, but for Vieira, his memories were of absence, of voids that could not be filled, of evenings when no one asked how his day had been. And over time, he no longer waited for that question. He learned to live without it. And that was what made him different, not because he was stronger, but because he had no other choice but to become that way. And in that process, he gradually lost a part of himself, the part of a child who needed to be loved, needed to be recognized, needed to be allowed to be weak. Instead, there was a person who always kept everything inside, always controlled his emotions, always stood firm, even when something inside was breaking. Those very years laid the foundation for everything that came later, because when he stepped into soccer, he brought not only talent, but also a past that had never been healed. And each step forward for him was not only getting closer to success, but also a way to prove that he was good enough, that he deserved to exist in a world that had once made him feel he did not belong. And perhaps that was something few people saw, because when they saw a strong, decisive, uncompromising Vieira on the pitch, they did not see the boy from back then, the one who had learned not to need anyone, the one who had accepted silence as part of life, and the one who had begun a very long journey from the moment his childhood disappeared, not with a loud noise, but with a wordless departure, leaving behind a person who would spend his whole life learning to stand firm without needing to be kept. The years that followed passed in a space where harshness did not need to be explained. It existed in every street, every look, every day, repeating the same way until people forgot what it felt like to live lightly. And Patrick Vieira grew up in exactly that environment, where childhood was not measured by joy, but by the ability to endure, where a child was not allowed to be weak for too long if he did not want to be left behind. And in that context, he was not the most outstanding, not the most noticed, but on the contrary, he always seemed to be on the edge of everything, not fully belonging to any group, without relationships deep enough to call attachment, without anyone truly entering his inner world. And over time, that lack of connection no longer made him sad. It became a familiar state, a form of existence he accepted as part of himself, because when a person does not find connection, they begin to learn not to need it, not because they do not want to, but because they understand that expecting it only hurts them more. On the streets of the suburbs, where every day was a small challenge, Vieira gradually formed a very personal way of living. He observed more than he spoke, kept distance more than he approached, and in that silence, he learned to protect himself, not through aggression, but through control, through not revealing what was happening inside, because once others could not see the weakness, they could not touch it either. And that gave him a sense of safety he could not get from anywhere else. But the price of that safety was isolation, an isolation not created by others, but built by himself to survive. And the longer he lived in it, the harder it was to escape, because it became the only way he knew to face the world. With few friends, no long conversations, no people to share deep thoughts with, Vieira gradually withdrew inside. And it was in that emptiness that soccer began to appear as something different. Not just a game, but the only place where he could exist without needing to explain himself, where he did not need to say much but was still seen, where what he did on the pitch could speak for all the things he could not say with words. And gradually, soccer was not only passion. It became a refuge, a space where he could unload some of the invisible pressures that had accumulated, a place where he could feel he had value, that his existence had meaning. And each time he stepped onto the pitch, he was not just playing soccer. He was finding a way to prove he deserved to be there. But even when soccer gave him an escape, it did not erase what had formed inside him, because the years of growing up without connection had left a deep mark, making him a person who always kept distance, always controlled emotions, always ready to face everything alone. And over time, that turned into a shell, a hard shell he carried not only on the pitch but in life itself, a shell that helped him stand firm under pressure, under competition, under scrutinizing eyes, but at the same time made it hard for him to open up, to share, to let others truly understand him. And that was the greatest paradox in his journey. The stronger he was on the outside, the more closed he became on the inside. There were moments when the silence became heavier than usual, when thoughts that could not be spoken kept returning, when questions from the past still had no answers. And in moments like that, he did not turn to anyone, did not try to explain, but only continued doing the only thing he knew: to keep moving forward, to keep everything under control, to keep becoming the version the world could accept. Because for him, stopping to face emotions was perhaps even harder than facing any opponent on the pitch. And that was why he chose not to stop, chose to turn everything into motivation, chose to let the most painful things become fuel for moving forward. It was in this period that something important was formed, not playing skills, not tactics, but the essence of who he was, a person who did not rely on anyone, did not wait for anyone, did not need anyone to understand him in order to keep going. And that was both strength and burden, because it helped him survive in a harsh world, but it also made him carry everything alone, with no place to unload, no one to share with, only one path: to move forward. And from a boy who had learned not to need anyone, Patrick Vieira gradually became a man the world would later see as a symbol of strength. But few realized that behind that strength was a long journey of silence, of learning to live without needing to be kept, and of accepting that there were voids that would never be filled, only carried, day after day. The more he grew up in that silence, Patrick Vieira began to take his first steps into professional soccer with a fragile belief that he could finally find a place to belong. And when the opportunity came with AC Milan, it was not just a contract, but an affirmation that all the years of endurance had meaning, an answer he had waited for so long, that he was good enough, that he deserved to stand among the best players, that he was no longer the boy left behind. But right at that place that seemed like the first peak, he once again had to face the familiar feeling he had tried to run from throughout his childhood. Because AC Milan was not a place for patience, not a place for a young player to be allowed mistakes or to develop slowly. It was a team of already complete stars, where every position was fierce competition. And in that environment, Vieira was not given the opportunity he had hoped for, not because he lacked potential, but because he was not yet complete enough to break into a squad operating at the highest level. And so he was pushed to the edge, not by clear words, but by silent decisions. Times when he was not fielded, training sessions where he was only a small, unnoticed part. Each day at Milan felt like a reminder that he had not yet escaped the shadow of the past, that no matter how far he had gone, the feeling of abandonment could return at any time. And what made it more painful was that this time, he was old enough to understand, aware enough to clearly feel every moment he was set aside. No longer a child vague about what was happening, but a person looking straight at the reality that he was not needed. And in those moments, old memories seemed to come alive, not through images, but through feeling, the feeling of a person not kept, not chosen, not seen. And though the context was different, though he was at one of the biggest clubs in the world, the nature of the pain was exactly the same as before. Did not speak out, did not complain, did not try to draw attention, because that was not the way he had learned to face difficulties. Instead, he continued in silence, continued working, continued waiting for an opportunity that seemed like it would never come. And in that waiting, a form of doubt began to form, not from others, but from himself, a silent but persistent question. Whether everything he believed about himself was really true, whether he was really good enough to exist at this level, or whether it was all just an illusion he had built to keep going. And the scariest thing was not others doubting him, but when he began to doubt himself, because when that happened, everything became more fragile than ever. There were training sessions where he felt he was doing everything right, but still not recognized. Matches where he could only sit outside and watch others play, wondering what he was missing. And each time like that, the silence became heavier, no longer a refuge as before, but an emptiness where negative thoughts could spread. And he began to realize that talent alone was not enough, that to survive in a place like Milan, he needed more: patience, time, the right opportunity. But the hardest thing was that no one could guarantee those things would come, and he had to keep going in uncertainty, with nothing to hold on to except himself. In that important period, when he should have been developing, accumulating experience, asserting his position, he stood still, not because he wanted to, but because circumstances did not allow him to move forward. And that made everything vague, with no clear direction, no sign that the future would be different, only the present repeating with small but continuous disappointments. And gradually, he had to face a difficult choice: either continue waiting in fragile hope, or accept that he needed another path, another place, another opportunity, even if that meant starting over again. But what made Vieira's story different was not that he encountered failure, but the way he reacted to it. He did not let it break him, did not let it define him. Even though inside he might have been wavering, even though the questions still had no answers, he still held on to the one thing he had carried from his earliest years: steadfastness in silence. And that was what helped him not collapse in a period when many others might have given up, because he understood that if he stopped, if he accepted that he was not good enough, then everything he had been through before would become meaningless. And he could not let that happen, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he had no other choice but to continue, to keep moving forward even without knowing what lay ahead, to keep believing in himself even when that belief was being tested. And it was in that continuation that something important was gradually forming: not perfect self-confidence, but the ability to stand firm even when everything around gave him no reason to do so. And perhaps it was from those forgotten days at Milan that Patrick Vieira began to become the man the world would later know, not because he had never been rejected, but because he had never let that rejection end his story. As the days at AC Milan gradually drew to a close in a feeling halfway between hope and disappointment, Patrick Vieira stepped into a period where even he could not be sure what awaited ahead. And then another door opened, not noisily, not welcomed with cheers, but carrying a meaning he had waited for so long: the appearance of Arsène Wenger, who saw in Vieira not just a young player with many shortcomings, but an untapped potential, a person who could become more than what he had been allowed to show. And in the soccer world, where opportunities usually come and go very quickly, what Wenger gave Vieira was not just a contract, but belief, something that seemed simple but was extremely rare for a person accustomed to being set aside. And that very moment, though without lights or applause, was a quiet but profound turning point in his life. At Arsenal, everything did not immediately become easy. There was no miracle erasing what he had been through before. But there was a very clear difference. For the first time, after a long time, he was given the opportunity to prove himself, not in short minutes, not in hasty trials, but in an environment where people were willing to wait for him to develop. And that changed the way he saw himself, because when someone believed in you, even a small belief could become the foundation for a person to stand firmer. And Vieira began to play soccer with a different feeling, no longer the tension of having to prove his existence, but the focus on becoming better day by day, match by match, touch by touch. And gradually, he not only regained his form but also began to build a new version of himself, stronger, more disciplined, and with clearer direction. But even as his career began to revive, as he gradually became an important part of the team, as his performances began to be recognized, one thing still did not change: the silent fear of failure existing inside, a fear not from the present but from the past, from the days of being abandoned, forgotten, doubted. And though the context was different, though he was in a more supportive environment, that feeling had never completely disappeared. It only receded, hid deeper, but was always ready to return whenever something did not go as planned, whenever he made a mistake, whenever the team faced difficulties. And that was why he never allowed himself to be completely comfortable, never let himself relax, because in his mind, just one moment of carelessness and everything could collapse as it had before. That made the way he approached soccer different. He did not play just to win. He played not to lose, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood clearly the feeling of losing everything and did not want to go through it again. And in every challenge, every run, every decision on the pitch, there was a part of him trying to control not only the match, but also what was happening inside himself, a war no one saw but always existed. And over time, that turned him into a player who was not only physically strong, but also mentally steadfast, a person who could stand firm under pressure, not because he did not feel pressure, but because he had become used to living with it. Success at Arsenal came gradually, not overnight, but through each season, each small step forward. And with it came recognition from teammates, from the coach, from the fans, things he had never truly had before. But the thing worth noting was that, no matter how valuable those things were, they still could not completely erase what had been imprinted in him from his early years, because wounds do not disappear just because circumstances change. They only get covered by new successes. And sometimes, the very contrast between past and present made them clearer, because the more he had, the more he realized how much he had once lacked. There were moments when he stood on the pitch, amid the cheers of tens of thousands of spectators, and still felt some void that could not be named, not because he did not appreciate what he had, but because there were things that could not be compensated by titles or recognition. And he understood that better than anyone, because he had lived through days when recognition was a luxury. And even though it had now come, it still could not completely change the way he saw himself, still could not make him feel truly safe, truly kept, truly without anything to worry about. And perhaps that was what made Vieira's journey special, not because he had been saved, but because even when saved, he still had to continue carrying what had once hurt him, not because he did not want to let go, but because some things had become part of who he was, inseparable. And instead of trying to erase them, he learned to live with them, to turn them into motivation, into strength, into the reason to keep moving forward. And in that process, he not only rebuilt his career, but also built a new way of existing, a way where he could stand firm between what he had been through and what he was achieving, without letting any of it break him. But even when everything seemed to be going in the right direction, even when he was gradually becoming one of the most important players at Arsenal, there was a truth he always carried. That success was not the end of pain. It was only another phase in the journey, a phase where he had to learn to live with what he had carried from before. And that was what made each step forward for him not only a step in his career, but also an effort to keep balance between past and present, between what had happened and what was happening, between the person he had once been and the person he was becoming. And in that fragile balance, Patrick Vieira continued to move forward. not like a person who had been healed, but like a person who had learned to live with his wounds without letting them stop him from moving ahead. It was no coincidence that Patrick Vieira began to change in a way that even those around him could not immediately notice, because after regaining his opportunity at Arsenal, he understood that opportunity was not something that could last forever, if not protected by above-normal effort. And from that silent fear that still remained, he began to push himself into a state not everyone could endure. A life rhythm revolving around training, discipline, and near absolute strictness with himself, where each training session was not only preparation for the match, but a test of his own limits, where he forced his body to go farther, stronger, more enduring, not because he wanted to stand out, but because he did not allow himself to return to the position of someone forgotten ever again. Those who witnessed Vieira in this period saw not only a progressing player, they saw a person changing in a more extreme direction, quieter, more focused, and almost separated from anything unrelated to soccer. Because for him, everything off the pitch gradually became unnecessary, not because he did not care, but because he did not want to distract the control he had worked so hard to build. And it was in that absolute focus that his playing style began to take clear shape. Strong, decisive, uncompromising, a style where every challenge was not just winning the ball but affirming presence, a declaration that he was no longer the boy pushed aside, that he had become an irreplaceable part, and no one could easily replace him anymore. But to achieve that, he had to pay a price not everyone saw, because to become strong to the point no one could doubt, he had to abandon the soft parts inside, not because they disappeared, but because he did not allow them to appear, not on the pitch, not in the locker room, not in front of teammates or the coach. And gradually, hiding emotions was no longer a choice. It became a reflex, a part of how he existed. And in that process, he began to trade away the things a normal person needs to keep balance. Moments of relaxation, times to share, times allowed to be weak, all set aside to make way for one single goal: maintaining form, maintaining position, maintaining control. There were days when his body was so tired it could barely continue, but he still stepped out to training as if nothing had happened, because in his mind, stopping was not an option, not because he did not want to rest, but because he feared that just slowing down one step and everything he had built would begin to shake. And that very fear turned him into a machine in the true sense, a person operating on discipline rather than emotion, on responsibility rather than personal desire. And in the eyes of others, that was professionalism, something admirable. But inside, it was a prolonged state of tension he never truly escaped. On the pitch, that showed clearer than ever. Every run of his had purpose, every tackle carried decisiveness, every decision was made with near absolute certainty. There was no room for hesitation, no space for mistakes. And that was what made him one of the most formidable midfielders, not just physically, but in the way he controlled the rhythm of the match, controlled space, controlled everything happening around him, as if he was always one step ahead of the rest. And in those moments, he was not just playing soccer. He was maintaining a state he had worked hard to build, a state where everything was under control, where there was no room for weakness or mistakes. But what few realized was that the better he controlled the outside, the tighter he had to hold what was inside. Because when a person gets used to not allowing himself to be weak, they also gradually forget how to face their own emotions. And over time, that created a distance, not only with others, but with himself. A distance he did not easily notice, but that was present in the way he lived, the way he reacted, the way he existed. And though that helped him reach the peak, it also made him colder, less connected, as if he was standing in the middle of the world, but not fully belonging to it. There were moments when people could see that in his eyes, not a lack of emotion, but excessive control, a near absolute calm even in the most tense situations. And that was both strength and a sign of something that had been suppressed for too long. Because no one could become like that without sacrificing a part of themselves, And Vieira was no exception. He had chosen the path of discipline, of control, of turning himself into a machine to survive and succeed. But in that process, he also gradually moved away from the things that made a person feel relieved, comfortable, and able to be himself. And perhaps that was what made his journey both admirable and thought-provoking. Because when looking at a strong, cold, controlling Vieira on the pitch, few thought about the price he had to pay to become that person, a price not measured by injuries or failures, but by what he had to keep inside, by how many parts of himself he had to give up to maintain the image the world saw. And in that perfection, there was one thing that always existed: a silent tension, a state never truly relaxed. Because when a person had gotten used to becoming a machine, returning to being a normal human was no longer easy. And Patrick Vieira continued to move forward in that state, stronger, more solid, but also more distant from what was really happening inside himself. Not long after he had shaped himself as an indispensable anchor in midfield, Patrick Vieira was given the Arsenal captain's armband, a moment many saw as a well-deserved reward for his effort and growth. But for him, it was not only an honor, but also a burden that began to weigh down in a way no one could see. Because from that point, every eye turned to him not only to expect tackles or passes, but also to seek stability, leadership, certainty in the most difficult moments. And that meant he was no longer a player who could focus only on himself, but had become the one who had to carry an entire group, a person who had to stand firm even when inside he might be wavering. In the locker room, in training sessions, in every match, his role changed in a way that could not go back. He was no longer the person who just did his own job well, but the one who had to observe, to adjust, to make decisions, to keep the team from falling into chaos when things did not go as wanted. And it was in moments like that that pressure did not come from opponents, but from the very responsibility he was carrying. Because being a leader was not only leading when everything was favorable, but holding firm when everything began to collapse. And that required a steadfastness not everyone could maintain for long. On the pitch, the duels with Roy Keane became symbols of a tense period, not only between two teams, but between two people representing two different approaches, yet similar in one point. Both carried the weight of leadership on their shoulders, and each confrontation was not only a battle for control of the match, but also an affirmation of status, a way they conveyed the spirit of their team. And in those duels, Vieira was not only fighting the opponent, but also the pressure inside. The pressure not to step back, not to show weakness, not to let any sign of hesitation appear. Because for him, just one moment of losing control, and everything he had built could be questioned. There were matches where everything did not go as desired, when the team faced difficulties, when the result was not favorable. And in those times, all eyes poured onto him not to find answers in words, but in the way he reacted, the way he stood up, the way he continued to lead no matter how bad the situation was. And that was what made him always have to maintain a state that did not allow himself to relax. Because if he collapsed, even for one moment, the whole team could lose its anchor. And that was something he never allowed to happen. But the price of always having to stand firm was that isolation gradually appeared, not because he had no teammates, not because he was not respected, but because his role created distance, a distance between the leader and those being led, a distance that could not always be narrowed. Because when a person always had to be the anchor, they rarely had the chance to lean on anyone else. And over time, that made him used to keeping everything to himself, not sharing, not revealing what was happening inside, because he understood that his role did not allow it. There were evenings after matches, when everything had ended, when the stadium became quiet, when he still carried thoughts no one saw, moments when he could wonder if he had done enough, if there was anything he could have done better, if there was any mistake he had not noticed. And in those questions, there was no one to answer, no one to share with, only himself facing himself. And that created a very particular kind of loneliness. Not from lacking people around, but from lacking a place to unload, lacking a space where he could stop being the leader and simply be a human. Nevertheless, he still continued, still stepped onto the pitch with the familiar decisiveness, still kept the team standing firm, still was the person teammates could look to when they needed an anchor. And that was what made him one of the most memorable captains, not because he was never wrong, but because he never allowed himself to stop, never let pressure make him retreat. And in the eyes of others, that was the image of a perfect leader. But behind that image was a man who had accepted living with pressure as an inseparable part, a man who had become used to standing alone in a position not everyone could understand. The more successful he became, the clearer that distance was, because when everything went well, people looked at the result without thinking about what had happened behind. And when things did not go as planned, the first person questioned was him, and that created a loop he could not escape, a loop of expectation, responsibility, and isolation, where he always had to deliver but was rarely asked how he was feeling. And over time, he no longer waited for that question, because he had become too used to carrying everything by himself. And perhaps it was in this period that the image of a Vieira the world knew was shaped most clearly, a strong, uncompromising captain who controlled everything on the pitch, but also a man who gradually became more distant from his own emotions, a person who had learned to stand firm under all pressure, but also had to accept that always standing firm meant there was nowhere to fall. And in that resilience, there existed a silent loneliness, not loud, not clear, but always present, like part of the price he had to pay to become the person everyone trusted but rarely truly understood. When Patrick Vieira stepped into the 2003-2004 season with Arsenal, the world saw a team at its peak, a cohesive, strong, and almost unbeatable collective, but few realized that behind that perfection was a long journey of pressure that no one could measure, because from the very first matches, when the unbeaten run began to form, it was not just an achievement, but became an invisible burden weighing on every player, every moment on the pitch, and especially on the shoulders of the captain, the one everyone looked to keep the rhythm unbroken, to ensure everything continued to function in a way no one dared to interrupt. Match after match, the unbeaten run stretched on, and with it came growing attention, not only from fans but from the entire soccer world. Each opponent stepped onto the pitch with a clear goal: to become the first team to defeat Arsenal. And that made every match a different kind of challenge. No longer an ordinary competition, but a war where the smallest mistake could break everything that had been built. In that situation, Vieira not only had to play well, he had to play perfectly, not in the sense of making no mistakes, but in the sense of always being in the right place at the right time, always making the right decision, always maintaining stability for the whole team, even when everything around him began to turn chaotic. That pressure was not always shown on the outside, because Arsenal kept winning, kept maintaining the run, and from the outside everything seemed to flow naturally. But inside, each player, especially Vieira, was expending more than what people could see, because maintaining perfection demanded not only physical effort, but also a continuously tense mental state, where there was no room for carelessness, no space to rest. And every time a match ended, instead of feeling relieved, he would start thinking about the next one, about how to keep the run from being interrupted, about how to continue standing firm against ever greater challenges. There were times when the body began sending signals, small accumulated pains, moments of fatigue that he could have ignored before. But in a season like that, there was no other choice but to continue, because stopping was not just resting, but could interrupt the rhythm of the whole team. And with his role, he did not allow that to happen. Not because he did not need rest, but because he believed his responsibility was greater than personal feelings. And so he continued to step onto the pitch, continued to fight, continued to hold his position, even when inside signs of exhaustion had begun to appear. The spirit was not spared from erosion either, because when a team drew close to something that had never happened, the fear of losing everything became clearer than ever. Each match that passed was not just a step forward but a step closer to the possibility of failure, a paradox that Vieira had to face. The more successful he became, the more vigilant he had to be. The farther he advanced, the tighter he had to hold on to what he had. And that created a state with no room for relaxation, no moment when he could truly let go and enjoy what was happening. Because in his mind, everything was not finished yet, and just one mistake could make it all disappear. When the season drew near its conclusion, when the unbeaten run was still maintained, when the whole world began to realize they were witnessing something special, that should have been the time to feel proud, to feel joy. But for Vieira, that emotion did not come fully, because the journey to achieve it had taken too much, not only physically but mentally. And even when the final match closed, when Arsenal officially completed the season without losing a single game, when history was written, he did not collapse in joy like many others, not because he was not happy, but because he had grown used to keeping everything under control, used to not letting emotions exceed limits. And in the moment when he should have been able to let go, he still stood there, solid, but not truly relieved. Victory, in this case, did not bring the release many imagined. It only closed one chapter and opened a new awareness that even when achieving something no one else had done, the feeling inside still did not change completely. That perfection was not something that could fill the voids that had existed before. And for Vieira, the unbeaten season was not the end point of a journey, but clear proof that he could reach the peak, but the price of being there was never truly being able to rest. And when the lights gradually dimmed, when the praises began to settle, what remained was not only titles but a tired body, a mind accustomed to pressure, and a man who still continued to keep everything inside. Because even if the world called them unbeaten, that did not mean they did not feel exhausted, did not mean they did not need to stop. It just meant they had grown used to continuing, even when there was not much energy left to do so. And Patrick Vieira, in the greatest season of his career, had become the symbol of that. A person who could stand firm against every challenge, but also a human being who had to pay the price with the very relief he had never truly obtained. But soccer does not stop for anyone, and even a symbol like Patrick Vieira could not avoid the moment when everything began to change. When the unbeaten season closed, when the spotlight was still there, but inside the team movements had begun that not everyone noticed immediately, the decision to leave Arsenal came in 2005, not like an explosion, but like a quiet transition, not noisy, not dramatic, but deep enough to create a void he had to face by himself. Because after many years of dedication, after becoming the soul of the team, leaving was not just changing environment, but leaving the only place where he had truly felt he belonged, the place where he had rebuilt his career, where he had found belief. And when he stepped out of there, he was not only leaving a club, but leaving a part of himself. At Juventus, everything was no longer the same. There was no longer the familiar feeling, no longer the central position he once held. And though he was still a top-class player, still had experience, still had ability, in a new collective he had to start again, not from zero, but from a lower position in a structure he had not fully understood. And that created a change that was not easy to accept, because when a person had grown used to leading, having to adapt to a different role was not only a professional issue, but also one of perception, of how he saw himself, of accepting that he was no longer the center of everything. The feeling of being replaced did not come suddenly. It appeared gradually, through matches where he was no longer placed in the most important position, through tactical decisions where he was no longer the pivot, through moments when he realized the team could function without needing him in the way it once could not imagine. And that, though not spoken, still left a mark, a familiar feeling he had experienced before, but this time it came after he had achieved everything. And that was what made it harder to understand, harder to accept, because how could a person who had once stood at the peak return to the feeling of being pushed to the side? The move to Inter Milan afterward continued to extend the journey of adaptation. And though he had moments of success, titles, certain contributions, his role was no longer the same. No longer the one controlling the rhythm of the match in every situation, no longer the one every ball had to go through. And over time, that not only changed how others saw him, but also changed how he saw himself. Because when part of his identity, built on being the center, was altered, that person had to find another way to define himself. And that was not easy. There were matches where he played, but no longer felt he controlled everything like before. Moments when he had to accept stepping back, giving space to younger, faster players. And that was not only a physical change, but a psychological adjustment. Accepting that time was doing what it always did, gradually taking away what had once been his strengths. And there was no way to stop it, no way to go back, only to continue moving forward in a new role he had never prepared for. What made this period difficult was not that he was no longer playing well, but that he had to face a reality no one had really prepared him for. That after everything he had achieved, there would come a time when he was no longer the first choice, no longer the one everything revolved around, and that demanded an acceptance not everyone could reach immediately, because it was not only related to soccer, but to how he understood his own value, to who he was when he was no longer in the position he had been familiar with for so many years. In that change, a familiar silence returned, not the silence of childhood, but the silence of a person trying to understand what was happening, not reacting, not complaining, not trying to resist something that could not be changed, but only continuing to move forward, continuing to do what he could, continuing to hold the values that had shaped him before, even when the surrounding circumstances had changed. And that was what helped him not collapse. But it also made him carry a feeling not everyone recognized, the feeling of a person who had once been the center, now having to learn to exist in a different position, no less important, but no longer the place he once stood. Perhaps the most painful thing was not leaving Arsenal, not changing clubs, but realizing that what had once defined him no longer existed in the old way, that he had to rebuild part of himself while still carrying everything that had passed. And in that process, he did not seek pity, did not seek attention, but only continued to move forward in the way he always had, quietly, steadfastly, and without allowing himself to stop, because no matter how the role changed, no matter how the position differed, one thing remained unchanged: the way he faced everything, without stepping back, without collapsing, but also never truly relieved before what he had to accept. Time does not stop, and for Patrick Vieira, that did not come as a single shock, but as a slow, quiet, yet irreversible process. As matches passed, seasons followed, he began to realize that his body no longer responded in the way he had been familiar with for many years. Runs were no longer as long as before, tackles no longer carried the same dominance. And though experience was still there, though game-reading ability was still sharp, something was gradually changing, not in thought, but in the way the body carried out what he wanted. And that mismatch forced him to face a reality no one could avoid. There were moments on the pitch when he saw the situation before it happened, knew exactly what he needed to do, but could not get there as fast as before, could not intervene at the right moment like he had done hundreds of times before. And that feeling was not only disappointment, but a clear awareness that the gap between intention and action was gradually widening, a gap he could not narrow by willpower alone. And that forced him to change the way he played, no longer relying completely on physicality, but more on positioning, on experience, on reading the game. But no matter how much he adjusted, he still knew he was no longer the version that had once dominated Arsenal's midfield. Matches that he once controlled from start to finish now became more difficult, not because he had completely lost ability, but because the intensity of top-level soccer did not allow any slowing down. And when younger players appeared with speed, energy, and endurance he once had, the difference became clearer with every touch, every situation. And that did not need to be spoken. It was present in the way the match unfolded, in the way he had to choose the moment instead of creating it, in the way he had to conserve energy instead of using it naturally like before. Physical condition no longer supporting the old style forced him to accept things he had never thought about before. More minutes of rest, matches without playing, decisions from the coach where he was no longer the default choice. And each time like that, he did not react, did not argue, but inside he understood clearly what it meant, understood that soccer was gradually moving on without needing him in the way it once did. And that was a feeling not easy to name, not completely sadness, not completely disappointment, but a form of acceptance coming from seeing the change happening right inside himself. There were training sessions when he realized he needed more time to recover. Mornings when the body was no longer as light as before. Small pains beginning to appear and not disappearing as quickly as before. And all of that accumulated, not noisily, not suddenly, but enough to remind him that everything was changing, that what had once been strengths were gradually becoming limits. And the hardest thing was not the change itself, but having to witness it happening day by day, step by step, with no way to stop it. In those moments, he did not turn back to the past to regret, did not try to deny reality, but looked straight at it in the way he had always faced every challenge, with silence and steadfastness, because he understood that resisting time was meaningless, that the only thing he could do was adapt, find ways to continue contributing within the new limits, keep himself valuable, even when no longer at the peak. And that demanded a different kind of maturity. No longer the strength of a warrior in his prime, but the calm of a person who clearly understood his position in this stage of life. But even with acceptance, that did not make the process easier, because every time he stepped onto the pitch, every time he saw the rhythm of the match, he still remembered the feeling of the years before, when everything happened the way he wanted, when he could control space, control rhythm, control even what opponents did. And that comparison, though not spoken, still existed, like a part of the memory he carried, a part of the person he had once been. And now he had to learn to live with it without letting it become a burden. There were players who left when they felt they were no longer at the peak. There were those who tried to extend it by any means. But for Vieira, this journey was not about extending or ending, but about clearly understanding the moment, understanding the change, and accepting it in the way he had always done, without show, without drama, but with a profound calm, because he knew that his value did not lie only in what he did on the pitch, but in the way he faced the most difficult periods. And this period, when he had to see himself changing, was perhaps one of the greatest challenges he had to overcome. And when the final seasons gradually passed, when his role continued to diminish, when appearances were no longer regular, he did not try to resist that flow, but let it happen naturally. Because after all, he had understood that there were things that could not be kept forever, that soccer, like life, always moved forward. And what mattered was not holding on to what had passed, but knowing when to let go, not as a failure, but as a transition to another stage, where he no longer needed to prove who he was, but only needed to accept the person he was becoming. A person who had gone through the peak, had experienced changes, and was learning to live with the truth that time did not take away his value, it only changed the way that value was expressed. Then came a time when continuing no longer carried the same meaning as before, when Patrick Vieira understood that his journey on the pitch had reached the point where it needed to stop, not because he had lost his love for soccer, but because he was clear-sighted enough to realize that some things could not be extended without losing their original value. And the decision to retire did not come as a shock, but as a slow acceptance. A transition he had prepared for a long time, even though he never spoke it. Because for a person who had dedicated his whole life to playing, stopping was not only ending a career, but leaving a part of himself that had been attached for too long, a part he had once used to define himself. And when that part closed, the question was not what he had achieved, but who he would become when he was no longer a player. There was no overly grand farewell ceremony, no long goodbyes. He stepped away from the pitch in the way he had lived, quietly, without show. But inside it was a profound change no one could fully see. Because when the lights went out, when there were no more cheers, no more rhythm of the match, he had to face a void that had not existed before, a void of time, of goals, of no longer having a match schedule to prepare for, no opponents to overcome. And in that void, he had to find a new direction, not to completely replace what had passed, but to continue moving forward in a different way. The coaching path opened not as a reward, but as a new challenge, where everything he had achieved before no longer guaranteed the next success. And when he stepped into the new environment at Manchester City's academy, he did not carry the status of a legend but like an apprentice, a person who had to start again from the beginning, observing, learning, and adapting to a completely different role, where he was no longer the one playing directly, but the one standing behind, directing, analyzing, and communicating. And that demanded a different way of thinking, a different approach that he had to rebuild from the most basic foundations. In the early days, he no longer had the certainty he had when playing. There was no longer the feeling of controlling everything, but instead, new questions, unclear things, situations that playing experience could not solve immediately. And that forced him to relearn, not only about tactics, but about communication, about building relationships with young players, about understanding people with different personalities, and about making decisions in a role he had never held before. And in that process, he did not have the advantage of fame to shield him, because in the coaching environment, results and leadership ability were what decided everything. There were times when he had to accept that he did not know, had to ask questions, had to listen, had to adjust his approach. And that was not easy for a person who had grown used to being the leader on the pitch, used to making decisions without hesitation. But that very change was necessary, because if he wanted to continue developing, he could not rely forever on the past, could not be only the version of a player in the role of a coach, but had to become a new person with new skills, with a new way of looking at soccer and at people. The training sessions at the academy did not have the pressure of tens of thousands of spectators, but had another form of pressure, the pressure of building, of creating something from almost nothing, of helping young players develop while he himself was still in the process of learning. And in those moments he was no longer the one standing at the center, but the observer, the supporter, the adjuster. And that created a change in how he perceived his role, from direct control to indirect influence, from acting to guiding. Nevertheless, this path did not bring certainty. There was no guarantee he would succeed as he had when playing, no titles promised, no position kept ready. And that very uncertainty made everything more difficult. Because every step forward had to be built from the beginning, every decision carried risk, and every result could change how others saw him. But instead of avoiding it, he accepted it as part of the journey. Because, after all, he had grown used to starting from points where no one was sure what would happen. There were moments when he could look back at the past, remember the days when everything was clearer, when he knew what he needed to do to win, when his role was clearly defined. But he did not let himself stop there, did not let memories become a refuge, but used them as a foundation to continue building. Because he understood that if he wanted to move forward, he had to accept no longer being in the familiar position, had to accept relearning, had to accept that failure could happen, and had to accept that this journey would not be like anything he had experienced before. And in that fresh start, with no guarantee, no clear path, there was only one thing he carried: the way he had always faced every challenge, with steadfastness, with silence, and with continuing to move forward even when he did not know the exact destination. Because for Patrick Vieira, starting over was not something strange, but a part of life, a part he had gone through since he was a boy, and now, in a new stage, he continued that journey again, not with certainty, but with a belief that no matter how difficult the road, he could still find a way to keep going. When he stepped out of the academy environment and began his professional coaching journey, Patrick Vieira carried not only the experience of a player who had once stood at the peak, but also the caution of a person who understood that this time everything would not come easily. And when he accepted the job leading New York City FC, it was the first opportunity for him to test what he had learned, to experiment with how he viewed soccer in a completely different role. But from the very first days, he realized that coaching was not a simple continuation of playing, but a world with its own rules, where every decision affected not just an individual, but the whole collective, and where success could not be guaranteed by past fame alone. The seasons at New York brought positive signs. The team had periods of good play, matches that showed his philosophy was gradually forming. But at the same time, there were moments when things did not go as desired. Inconsistent results, losses that were not easy to explain. And in the professional soccer environment, where everything was judged by results, that inconsistency became a problem, not just for the team, but for his own position. And though there was progress, it was not clear enough to erase the doubts that began to appear from outside. When he moved to lead Nice, the pressure did not decrease, but became even greater, because the European environment carried different expectations, different standards, and every decision was monitored more closely. Every result carried greater meaning. And in that context, Vieira continued to face challenges with no simple solutions. There were matches where his team played well, but did not win, periods when form dropped that could not be reversed immediately, and gradually patience began to wear thin, not only from the board but from observers outside. Doubts began to appear more clearly. No longer gentle comments but direct questions about his ability, about whether a great player could become a good coach. And in a world where success was measured by immediate results, his past was no longer enough to protect him from those evaluations. And when the dismissal decision came, it was not announced as a big shock, but as a move many had predicted. But for him, it was still a moment when he had to face the reality that this journey was not going the way he wanted. Moving to Crystal Palace, he started again in a new environment, with new people, with the hope that this time things would be more stable, that what he had learned would help him create a difference. And in reality, there were periods when that happened. The team played with clearer spirit, more organized, with more identity. But once again, stability did not last. Unwanted results began to appear, and the familiar loop returned, pressure increased, questions appeared, and finally the parting decision was made again. Not noisy, not dramatic, but enough to remind him that this path was never easy. What was worth noting was not those failures, but the way he faced them. There were no harsh statements, no long excuses, no public reactions to fight criticism. He kept silent, not because he felt nothing, but because he had grown used to handling everything inside, used to not letting emotions control how he acted. And in that silence, he continued working, continued thinking, continued finding ways to understand what had happened and what needed to change. There were people who would speak up to defend themselves, to explain, to try to control the narrative, but Vieira did not choose that path. He let the results speak for him, and when the results were not good enough, he accepted the consequences without trying to shift blame, not to the players, not to circumstances. And that, though not spoken, showed another form of strength, not the strength of winning, but the strength of enduring without losing oneself, of failing without letting it define the whole person. Doubts about his coaching ability did not disappear. They existed alongside every step he took, every time he took a new job, every time he stepped into a new locker room. There was always a lingering question: could he do it? And that question came not only from others, but sometimes from himself. in rare moments when he allowed himself to think deeper. But instead of letting it stop him, he used it as motivation, not to prove to the world, but to prove to himself that this journey was not over yet. In all of that, one thing did not change: the way he kept silence, not as avoidance but as a choice, a way to keep himself from being drawn into outside noise, a way to focus on the only thing he could control, his work. And though that path did not bring immediate results, though it came with failures no one wanted to experience, he still continued. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not know any other way to live except continuing to move forward, as he had done from the first days of his life. After all the changes on the coaching bench, when questions from outside had never really stopped, Patrick Vieira did not try to step out to explain, did not appear more to clarify the story, but chose a path familiar to him from very early on, withdrawing inside, keeping distance from the outside world in the way he had learned since he was a boy. And over time, that was no longer a reaction to pressure, but became part of how he existed, a way of living in which personal things were kept private, not to create mystery, but to protect a part he did not want touched. He rarely shared his emotions, not because he had none, but because he was not used to putting them out, not used to letting others see what was happening inside. And in a world where many chose to speak to be understood, he chose silence, not as defiance but as an instinct, a way to keep everything under control. Because for him, once emotions were revealed, they could exceed the limits he had set. And that was something he always avoided. The media, with all its attention and ability to create stories, was not a place he turned to. He appeared when necessary, when the job required it. But beyond that, he did not seek the spotlight, did not try to maintain constant presence. And in that absence, there was a clear message. He did not define himself through how others saw him, did not need external confirmation to feel he had value. And that, though it might make him seem distant in many people's eyes, was the way he kept himself from being drawn into whirlpools he could not control. There were times when criticism became clear. Analyses and evaluations of his work appeared in newspapers and commentary programs, but he did not react, did not offer explanations, did not try to reshape the story in his favor. And that was not because he did not care, but because he had chosen a different way of facing things. Not with words, but with continuation, with focusing on what he could do, and letting what was outside happen in its own way without intervention. Not explaining, not justifying did not make the doubts disappear, but it helped him keep something more important: consistency in the way he lived, because if he started reacting to everything outside, he would gradually lose the control he had built. And that, for him, was unacceptable, because from very early on he had learned that the world was not always fair, that not every story could be fixed with words, and the only way to exist was to hold himself steady while everything around might change. A life separated from the spotlight was not a complete rejection, but a conscious choice, a way to create space where he could breathe, could exist without constantly facing evaluation. And in that space, he found a form of quiet he had never had when playing or at the peak. Not absolute peace, but a reduction of unnecessary noise. And that allowed him to look back at his journey in a way not influenced by what others thought. It might be hard for many people to understand his silence, to see it as distance, as something that made him seem aloof. But if looked deeper, it was part of a story that had begun long ago, from the days when he learned not to need anyone to continue, from the moments when keeping everything inside was the only way not to be hurt more. And over time, that did not disappear. It only changed form, from a protection mechanism to a way of living, from a reaction to a choice. In the soccer world, where everything was usually exposed, where each person's story was told through countless angles, choosing to live discreetly like that was not common. But for Vieira, it was not something he needed to think too much about, because he did not seek attention, did not need to prove himself by appearing. And that allowed him to keep a part untouched by what happened outside, a part that belonged only to him, not to titles, not to roles, but to the person he had become after all. And in that separation, he continued to exist in the way he understood best, without noise, without show, without trying to please everyone, but only holding firm to what he believed was right. And perhaps that was what made his story different. Not because he avoided the world, but because he chose to stand in that world without letting it define him. A choice that was not easy, but one he had made throughout his life, from when he was a boy, learning not to need anyone, to when he became a man who did not need to explain to be understood. After all the silent choices and distance that Patrick Vieira kept for himself, there was one truth he never denied, though he did not speak it. There were things that had never appeared in his life from the very first years, and therefore there was no way to find them later. Not titles, not money, but the very basic things many people took for granted. The feeling of being fully protected, of being recognized without having to prove, of being allowed to be weak without being judged. Those things, for him, were not experiences but voids, a void that had formed very early and followed him through every stage, not disappearing when he succeeded, not shrinking when he was honored, but existing as an inseparable part of who he was. When his career developed, when he began to achieve what many dreamed of, from big titles to leadership positions, it seemed like everything was compensating for what he had lacked. But reality was not that simple, because success did not replace experiences that had not happened. It only created another layer on the outside, a layer the world saw, while inside what had formed before remained the same. And that very parallel created a kind of contradiction not everyone understood. A person who had everything, but still carried a feeling of lack, not because he did not appreciate what he had, but because there were things that could not be replaced by any achievement. The trade-off between success and emotion did not happen in one specific moment, but accumulated over time. Through each decision, each period when he had to choose between continuing to move forward and stopping to feel. And most of those times he chose to move forward, not because he did not want to stop, but because he had grown used to putting responsibility above personal emotion. And gradually that became the way he lived, a way in which emotions were not denied but set aside. Not to eliminate them, but so they would not obstruct the path he was on. And in that process, he achieved a lot, but also left behind parts he did not have the chance to return to. There were victory moments that for many were the peak of emotion, a place where all pressure was released, a time to feel relief. But for Vieira, those moments were never completely like that, because even when he stood at the peak, when everything around was honoring him, a part of him still kept alertness, still kept control, not allowing emotions to exceed limits. And that made joy never complete in the way others felt it, not because he was not happy, but because he did not allow himself to let go completely, did not allow himself to lose the control he had built as a way to exist. Pressures did not disappear when he succeeded. They only changed form, from having to prove he was good enough to having to maintain the position, from having to be seen to not being allowed to make mistakes. And over the years, those pressures did not decrease but accumulated, piling on top of each other, creating a state he had to carry continuously, with no clear stopping point, no period when he could completely let go. And that made his life, though it looked stable from the outside, always exist at a level of tension not easy to notice. There were days when he could look back at his journey, not to regret, but to understand more clearly what had happened. And in that process he realized that every step forward came with a trade-off. Every success required a part of himself to be set aside. And though he had no regrets, he also did not deny that there were things lost along the way. Not because he did not want to keep them, but because circumstances did not allow him to do so. And when looking back, he did not try to change the past, but accepted it as part of the story that had created the person he was today. A life always in a state of endurance was not something people easily recognized from the outside, because it did not show through clear actions but through the way he continued to move forward, through not stopping, not complaining, not letting what was inside affect how he performed his role. And that, over time, became a form of strength but also a form of burden, because when a person got used to enduring, they also got used to not seeking release, not seeking a stopping point. And that made them continue carrying everything, day after day, without a real chance to let go. It might be that, for many people, Vieira's journey was a success story, proof that effort could take a person from difficult circumstances to the peak, and that was not wrong. But if looked deeper, it was also the story of a person who had to go through so much without always having the chance to fully feel what he achieved, a person who had learned to exist by controlling, by keeping silent, by continuing no matter how tired. And that was what created an image the world admired, but also hid what was spoken of less, what had been lost along that path. And when all was put together, from childhood to career, from victories to difficult periods, one thing became clear: that his journey was not only about achieving what others could see, but also about carrying what others could not see, a journey in which strength was not a choice but something required. And its price did not lie in what he had been through, but in what he had not had the chance to experience, the small, simple things that a person needed to feel complete. And for Patrick Vieira, that was perhaps the part he had lost, not in one moment but throughout a long journey. When looking back at Patrick Vieira's entire journey, from the early days in Senegal to the cold streets in France, from the boy who learned to stay silent to survive, to the man who stood at the peak of world soccer, there was one thread running throughout that never broke. It was not titles, not victories, but the ability to continue moving forward even when inside there was nothing left to hold on to. Because from the moment his childhood was cut short, he had begun a journey in which collapsing was not an option, not because he did not want to, but because circumstances did not allow him to stop long enough to do so. And that was what shaped the person the world later saw. A person who never broke in front of others, but always carried everything inside. From the forgotten years at AC Milan, where he had to face the feeling of being set aside when he most needed to be given a chance, to the days at Arsenal, where he was given belief and turned it into a career few could match, his journey did not follow a straight line of success, but a chain of challenges following one after another. Each challenge required him to be a little stronger, a little more steadfast. And in that process, he developed not only as a player but as a person who learned to control everything on the outside so as not to have to face directly what was happening inside. When he became captain, when he led a team to achievements that history would always remember, the world saw a perfect leader, a person who never stepped back, never lost control. But behind that image was a different reality. A person who had grown used to standing alone in the most important moments, a person who understood that responsibility came with isolation, that the higher the position, the greater the distance between him and those around him, and that was not something he chose, but something he accepted as part of the role he took on. The unbeaten season, the peak of his career, should have been the place where all pressure was released, where he could stop and feel what he had achieved, but for him it was instead clearer proof that even when everything went perfectly, the feeling inside still did not change, that winning did not mean being able to rest. And from that moment, he began to understand that his journey was not about finding an ending point, but about learning to live in a state of continuing, with no real pause. When he left Arsenal, when he stepped into the final chapters of his playing career, when he was no longer the center of everything, no longer the one the team revolved around, he once again had to face another form of loss, not the loss of opportunity, but the loss of the position he had built for many years. And in that process he did not resist, did not try to hold on, but accepted the change, as he had accepted everything before, with silence and steadfastness, even though that meant having to watch himself gradually move away from the version he once was. The decision to retire was not an ending but a transition, a step he had to take, even knowing there was no guarantee ahead. And when he stepped into his coaching career, he started from the beginning again, with no fame to protect, no position to rely on, only what he could build day by day. And in that journey, he did not avoid failures, doubts, dismissals, questions about his ability that he never answered with words but with continuing to work, continuing to learn, continuing to go through what was difficult without letting them define the whole person. His silence, which many did not understand, was not distance, but the way he kept himself from being drawn into things he could not control, a way to protect what remained after everything he had been through. And in that silence he continued to live, not like a legend trying to maintain an image, but like a person who had been through so much and chose to keep what was most important, even if not everyone could see it. It might look from the outside like a success story, a person who had achieved what very few could touch, but if looked deeper, it was also the story of a person who had to carry so much without always having the chance to let go, a person who did not collapse, did not break, did not let what happened destroy him, but also was never truly relieved in the way others could feel. And that was what created an image that was both strong and heavy, an image where resilience was not a choice, but the only thing possible. His legacy was not only in the titles, in the matches, in the moments fans still remembered, but in the way he had lived through all of that. The way he had held himself steady while everything around changed. The way he had continued even when there was no guarantee that continuing would lead to something better. And in a world where many sought recognition, he became an example of not needing to be fully understood to still be able to move forward. A person whose value did not lie in being seen but in still standing firm when no one was looking. And perhaps what made Patrick Vieira's story haunting was not what he had achieved, but the way he had achieved it, not with lightness, but by carrying everything, from the voids of childhood to the pressures of his career, from doubts to expectations, all kept, not eliminated, not forgotten, but becoming part of the journey, part of who he was. And though that made the road heavier, he still did not stop, still continued, not because he was not tired, but because he did not know any other way except to keep stepping forward. There were people who collapsed then stood up, people who broke then rebuilt, but there were also people who never collapsed, never broke in front of others, and because of that they carried everything longer, deeper. And Patrick Vieira was one of them, a person whose strength did not lie in overcoming one moment, but in enduring an entire journey without letting it destroy him. And in that endurance, there was a beauty not everyone recognized, a beauty of steadfastness, of continuing even when there was no clear stopping point, and of accepting that life did not always bring balance, but could still be lived fully in its own way. And when the story closed, what remained was not only the image of a player, a captain, a coach, but a person who had been through everything without losing himself, a person who had carried so much without letting it pull him down, a person who was never truly able to rest, but also never stopped stepping forward. And perhaps that was what made him a legend, not only on the pitch, but in the way he existed in a world that was always changing, a world where not everyone could keep the steadfastness he had. The story of Patrick Vieira left a feeling very hard to name, both admiration for a person who had never collapsed and heartache at realizing he had to carry so many things without the chance to let go. And what made it heartbreaking was not the failures, but the very way he won yet still could not find relief. From a childhood lacking family connection, emotional abandonment, to the period of being forgotten at AC Milan. All of that created a person who always had to control himself to the point of almost not allowing himself to be weak. Then when given the chance, by Arsene Wenger at Arsenal, he rose to become captain, won the World Cup and the unbeaten season. But as the story has shown, even at that peak he still could not truly enjoy the joy, because the fear of failure and the habit of endurance had sunk deep into the way he existed. And when he moved to the final stage of his career, left Arsenal, lost the central position, then witnessed his own physical decline, continued facing dismissals as coach at New York City, Nice or Crystal Palace, he still kept silent, did not justify, did not complain, as if all pressure had to be kept inside. That both earned respect and caused heartache, because a person strong to the point of never collapsing was also a person who was never truly able to rest. For American audiences, where individual success and the never-give-up spirit are valued, this story carries a deeper lesson than victory: the balance between ambition and mental health. Because if one only continues moving forward without allowing oneself to stop, to share, to heal, then even the greatest achievements can become empty. And Patrick Vieira is living proof that success is not always the same as peace. Therefore, the real lesson is not only to be resilient like him, but also to learn to open up, to seek support, and most importantly, to allow oneself to be a complete human being, not just a winning machine. If Patrick Vieira's story makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to honor a person who was strong in a very quiet way. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone dares to tell.